In this microcast, I want to show you how you can combine various tools and frameworks to quickly throw together a project prototype. One of the things I love about playing with new frameworks and technologies is that once you make it through the learning curve, you have a new tool in your arsenal to help you build your own projects. And that's what this is all about. In this episode, I want to show you how you can use the Express framework, Bootstrap, and Angular to build out a project quickly. Our goal will be to build a knockoff of the CommandPy app that was recently released to the App Store. CommandPy is an iOS application that gives you real-time information about your Raspberry Pi, things like memory and CPU usage, temperature, and so forth. It uses SSH and can only run on an iOS device. For our prototype, we're going to have the Pi itself serve up the application so it can be accessed from any modern browser. In the last couple of microcasts, we've learned about how to get this information from our Pi and written some code to help us. To recreate the application, we'll use some of that code and show you how to wire everything up to run on your Pi. As a disclaimer, this microcast isn't meant to go in depth on any of the technologies used, but serves as an example of how using various frameworks can help you quickly create a project prototype. I'm going to go pretty fast, so if you don't understand something, that's okay. Rewind parts if you need to, and I'm always happy to answer any questions. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is generate our web server, and for that we're going to use Express. And so I'm going to cd into my projects folder here, and all I have to do is Express and then give it a name for our very basic setup here. And you'll see that'll create a whole bunch of files for me that'll help us get started. So I'm going to cd into that. And then what I'm going to do, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this project in Sublime Text so that we can just start editing it right away. All right, now we're going to come into package.json here, and this lists all of the packages that will get installed when we run npm install. And there's some stuff in here that we don't necessarily need or care about right now, and so I'm going to remove them just so that the Raspberry Pi, when we eventually port this over, doesn't have that much to download. So I'm going to get rid of things like this fave icon. Morgan is a logging framework. We don't want that. We don't need to parse cookies. And we'll leave the rest of those in there. You can see up here the scripts that to run this, we're basically going to do node and then run the www file located in our bin folder right up here. And so that looks good. Let's save that. Okay, next up we have our app.js here. And we're going to remove those same things that we removed before. Fave icon, Morgan, cookie parser. And Express tries to be helpful and sets up this user concept for us in case we need to have a concept of users in our website. We don't, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Remove these. Okay. And that looks good. Clean that up and it is ready to roll. Now, if we come back here, the first thing that we need to do before we can run this is do an npm install. And what that's going to do is install all of the packages that the Express website needs to run. So we'll let this go ahead and finish. All right, now what we should be able to do at this point is just run node bin www, which should start up a web server for us. And now I would show you here in my Ubuntu virtual machine, but the web browser won't refresh as quickly there. So what I'm going to do is pull up a web page that I have out here, and I know the address of my Raspberry Pi is 10.0.0.14 and it's port 3000. And you can see there we have a simple Express website set up and ready to go. All right, awesome. Let's come back into our virtual machine here, and we're gonna go ahead and cancel that for now. Now what we need to do is we want to show some monitoring of some things from our Raspberry Pi, things like CPU usage, memory usage, temperature. And so we need a way to get that information down to our browser. And for that, we're going to use a concept known as a route. You can see here in our app.js, we have this app.use /, which basically says the home page or the root URL is going to be served up by this routes object here. And if we come in here, we've got users here. We can get rid of this, delete that. If we come into index, we've got router.get and then the /, and then it's going to call res.render. Now to all of these router functions, it has a callback that has a request and a response. The request here and the response here. And we can do things like render views. Well, in our case, we just want to get some data back. So let's do a router.get, and then let's just call it stats. And then the callback will follow that same pattern. Now we don't want to render a view, we want to return some data. So what we can do actually in Express here is we can do something like this, res.json, and then we can just pass it some JSON here. Monitor working true. Okay, and we can save that. We can come back to our terminal here and run that. And now if we come to the /stats URL, you can see that we've got monitor working true. All right, that's working great. So let's come back. Now that we have the route working, we don't want to display this monitor. What we want to do is display the statistics that we have from the code that we've already written to grab things like the CPU usage, memory, and all that stuff. So let's cancel this. You can update view files without restarting the server, but when you're going to mess with routes and things in Express, you need to stop the server and restart it. So let's come here and let's create a new file. And we'll call it pinode_stats.js. And what we're going to do for that is I have a gist out here that I wrote. And we'll just do the view raw. Basically, this is the Node.js module for collecting all that stat information that we want. Copy that, and we'll just paste it in. All right, now one thing that we'll want to do here is it's set up to read temperature. Now I'm running this in Linux, and all this will work in Linux except for this temperature reading thing here. So this is Raspberry Pi specific. So let's go ahead and comment that out. And then I have these lines up here just for testing that we can uncomment. Save that. So we've got our stats plugged in here, and right here at the bottom we have a usage. So let's copy that out, come back into our route.index. Now instead of doing this static JSON here, let's just go ahead and paste in that example code, and we'll uncomment it. And then we don't want this var stats down here, so we'll cut this out and put it up here at the top of the rest of them. And in our case, pinode_stats.js isn't in the same directory, so we'll do a ... there. We have to go up a directory. Instead of doing a console.log on the data that we get back, we'll just do a response.json. Okay, get rid of that, save it, restart our web server, and now let's give it a shot. All right, awesome. Look at that. We've got our memory total, free, cached, our percentage used, CPU, and the mock temperature values that we are returning there. Great. So now that we're getting this back, we need to display it somehow. We don't want to just view it as JSON. We want to view it in a nice sort of a web GUI form. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in and look at these views here. Now, the way Express is set up by default, it has this layout.jade, which is sort of the overriding template. It uses the Jade syntax, which you can learn more about. We're actually not going to use it right here because our index, this is where we get that welcome page that we saw earlier. And so what we can actually do to trick this is we're just going to do a new file here. We're going to call it index.html. Save that, and you can see here we're just going to say this is some static text. All right, and then we can come to our index.html, or sorry, our index.jade, and instead of doing this, we can just say include index.html. And what that will do basically is render that HTML for us. So if we come back here, and we come back to our home page, there we go. This is some static text. Okay, so, but what do we really want to display? Well, we want to display that information, and we want to make it look as nice as we can, but we don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And so the whole purpose of this µCast is to show you how you can pull all of these different modules together to make something that is functional, looks pretty good, and doesn't take you a lot of time. So for that, we're going to use Bootstrap. Now, you can come to getbootstrap.com here, go to Getting Started, and over here on the right-hand side, we've got these examples. And it shows some examples here. You can take one of these and build off of it. Another site that I like to use is called bootply.com, and they have some templates here. If we scroll down, they've got a control panel and a dashboard example. So let's click on this dashboard. Okay, so this is sort of what we're looking for. It has some elements that we might want to reuse. Like this reports here has some progress bars that might be good for memory usage and CPU usage. This table over here might be nice to display more detailed memory information. So this looks like something that we could reuse in our project. And so all I'm going to do is right click, do view page source, do a control A to get all of that, copy it, come back over to our virtual machine, highlight that, and paste it in. Now down here at the bottom, we have this Google Analytics script that we don't need to keep. We can get rid of that. And then if we come up to the top, we can just start editing this right away. For our title, let's get rid of that and call it PyMonitor. We don't need this second title here. And you can see that Bootstrap is actually included here via the CDN, and that's exactly what we want. Now, I don't have any of these Apple Touch icons, so let's just get rid of those. And we'll save that. And I actually saved that in the wrong file, so let's X that and paste it into here, save it, and change this back to include index.html. Okay, that should do it. Let's close that so we don't accidentally edit it again. Okay, now let's come back over to our page here and refresh it, and boom, we have that dashboard ready to go. Okay, so like I was saying, I like this reports panel here, and I also like this table. Those are really the only two things I care about keeping right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into that HTML, and I'm going to take everything else out. I'm just going to start ripping things out. So if we come back over to here, we can just start doing that. You can come down here, go past all the CSS. Now, I don't need this nav bar here over on this side. This whole left column here, I'm just going to collapse and delete because I don't want anything in that left column. And then this is the right column. Got a lot of stuff up here that I don't really care about. The inbox messages I don't care about. So let's get rid of those. And here's my progress bar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all the progress bars except for one, because if we want to duplicate it, we can do that easy enough. So I want to keep this panel. So I'm going to take this whole panel right here. I'm going to put it up at the row level. Okay, we have a whole tab section here. We don't need any of that. Here's our table, so let's go ahead and grab that. Just that out. We'll, for now, let's toss that up inside of our panel here. All right. And then if we can just find where that panel ends, right there, let's just get rid of the whole thing. All right, then we have a bunch of stuff down here that looks like we can also get rid of. Let's just take all of this out. Okay, now that's much, much thinner. And what we're going to do is we're going to change this column from a 9 to 12, which in Bootstrap is going to be the full width. And that should do it for us. I'll change this just to be consistent. All right, now let's see what that gives us. Let's hit F5 here. Okay, great. We've got just the reports, and we've got the table that we were looking for. Great. All right, so what I'm going to do, we want to track 3 things here, right? We want to track CPU usage, memory usage, and the temperature. So what we're really looking for are 3 different columns. So let's come over here, do a div, class equals, column medium. We want 3 of them split between 12, so we'll do 4 right there. And we'll come down here and close that off. And we want 3 of those. So let's copy this and paste it. Now we only want the table in one of them. So what I'm going to do for now is just remove the table from the first and the last, and we'll leave it in the middle. We'll do memory as we'll do the CPU usage as the first one, memory as the middle one, and temperature as the right column. So if we do that, and let's take out these small things here above the progress bars. So our first thing here is going to be CPU usage. Maybe it'd be nice to have like the percentage in parentheses there. And I'm going to change the default here to primary, just to give it a little bit more color. This will be memory usage, and down here we'll say temperature. Okay, so let's just go like that and do this in small chunks to make sure that we're making progress here. So let's refresh this. Oh, awesome. Okay, so we've got the CPU usage, the memory usage, and the temperature. Now, temperature is not really going to be a progress bar, and we're going to have some different columns here. So let's go ahead and flesh out the rest of the view here. Now for the temperature, I don't want to use a progress bar. So let's see what else Bootstrap has to offer us here. So if we come back up to the top, come over to components, one of the things I really like to use for stuff like this are the labels right here. And what we'll do is we'll just take the primary and the success, and we will drop them in here. And let's go ahead and stick them inside of an H2. Okay, so let's see how we're coming along here. Come back over here, hit refresh. All right, that looks pretty good. I mean, it's not the greatest, but it looks pretty nice and clean. So we've got our CPU usage here that it can tell us what we're doing, memory usage, and temperature. So now that we have our layout fixed, we need to figure out how to get the information that we set up on this route, this stats route. We need to figure out how to get this information here into our view here. And that's where Angular is going to come in. Now, again, Angular has a bit of a steep learning curve, so I'm going to go through some of this. If some of it doesn't make sense, maybe rewind and watch it again, or just dig into the Angular documentation and learn more about it. I'm going to go kind of quick through this just to give you an example, but you'll see that there's very little code that we need to write in Angular to wire all this up. So let's go ahead and take care of that next. So there's really 2 parts to hooking up Angular. We need to make our index.html Angular aware and wire it up, and then we're going to need to have a little bit of code on the back end. And by the backend, I mean just a JavaScript file, not actually on the server side. So let's come into public JavaScripts, and let's create a new file here. We're going to call it pymonitor.js. And the first thing you're going to want to do in any JavaScript file is use strict. And then what I like to do is just a really simple test. And you'll see this in just a second. So let's come back to index.html. Now to wire up Angular, we can come to the home page here. Really all it is some JavaScript files that we need to include that give us a lot of power and functionality. And so we're going to come down here. You can see in the simple example, we can pull in a script from the CDN. Now, I know from what we're going to try to do here that we need more than just the base Angular JavaScript file. So if I scroll down a little bit, there's an example here that has the two that I'm going to need, which is the base Angular and then the resource, Angular resource. I just copy those. And we'll just come down to the bottom right before the closing body tag, and we'll paste these in. And then we're also going to want to add our script. So we'll do source equals /javascripts /pymonitor.js. Okay, now with those in, we have all the functionality of Angular that we're going to need to tap into. So what I do is I come back here and I'm going to hit refresh, and I see that working. Now what that tells me is that I've named my file correctly, I've referenced it correctly in my HTML, so I know that it's picking up the code that I'm going to write in pymonitor.js. Seems like a silly test, but I can't tell you how many times I've had a project with a lot of JavaScript files where I've not been including one correctly, and this is just a quick way to verify that. So I'll hit OK. We'll come back here. So now this file is ready for our Angular code. And the first thing that we're going to want to do for Angular is we're going to create our app. And to do that, we're just going to say angular.module, and then we're going to give it a name. In this case, let's call it pymonitor. And then we're going to pass it an array of resources that we're going to need to have access to, that it's going to inject into our application. And I just know that we're going to need this ng resource, so I'll go ahead and include it there. The next thing that we're going to do is create a controller. And this is what's going to allow us to interact with the view, that main view that we just created. So the way we do that is just app.controller. Again, the first thing we're going to do is give it a name, call it stat-controller. And then we're going to pass it an array that has a list of items that we want to inject into our controller, and then a function call with those items injected. So the syntax on this is a little weird at first, but you get used to it. So one of the main concepts in Angular is this thing of scope. So we'll include that, and then a function that gets called with it. All right, so that sets up our controller. And what we can do inside of our controller here is we can take that scope and we'll say stat data. Scope.statData equals, and then let's just create some dummy data here. For example, let's say temp C is 99.9. What that allows us to do is access this scope from inside of our view, but we have to wire that up in our HTML. Remember, I told you there was two parts. There's this Angular JavaScript where we're wiring everything up, and then we need to connect it to our view. So that's really simple. Here in our HTML, we're going to come to this top HTML tag, do an ng app equals, and then just give it the name of our app, which if you remember is pymonitor. Then we're going to come down and we need to wire up the controller. And I like to do that just on this main container here. So we'll say ng controller equals stat controller. And what that allows us to do is now under this div, we have access to the scope variable that we set up. So let's come down to our temperature here, and instead of 0 degrees C, we can use this Angular notation and say stat data.tempC. If you remember, that's what we called it. And we'll save that. And so now let's see what happens when we come back over to our web page and refresh. Right there, 99.9 is exactly how we wired that up. So now all we need to do is bring our stat data into our controller, into that scope, and then we can populate all of these things in our view with it. So let me show you how to do that. We're going to come back over to here, and another concept that is very popular in Angular is that of services. And you create services that you can then inject into things like controllers. So to create one of those, we're going to do app.service and then give it a name. Let's just call it our stat service. And same thing, you'll see the pattern here. We're going to pass it an array of things that we need to inject and then a function. And what we're going to do is use this built-in Angular module called resource to get our data. Okay. Now the documentation for resources on the Angular website, I'm not going to go too much in depth on that, but essentially what we want to do is from any service that we write, we need to return an object that is the service. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to return calling the resource function, and we're going to call this stats. Now this is the URL that it's going to call. If you remember, we set up our route, it's /stats, and that's what this is saying right here. We don't need to pass it any default data. And then we just need to create an object here that has various functions that we can call. So we're going to call a get function here, and we just need to tell it, how do you want to call the stats resource as an HTTP REST call. So it might not make sense, but let's just show you what the syntax is here. So when we call the get on our service, we want to call the stats URL using the HTTP get method. You could also do put and post and things like that, and just define more here. Like you can come down here and say, I want the put method put. You get the idea. Right now all we care about is get. So once we do that, we're ready to inject this service into our controller. And to do that, all we do is tell Angular we're going to need the stat service and then add it as a parameter to our function. Now, in the function parameter list here, you can name it whatever you want. I could name this, Kevin. But just to be consistent, we'll call it stat service. Like that. And so what we're going to do is instead of setting scope.stat data like this, we're going to use our service. So we're going to say stat service .get. And what that's going to do is make an HTTP GET call to our /stats URL. Whatever JSON data that sends back, it's going to populate stat data with. And so what we can do is access all of that data now in our view here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to stats, and I'm going to copy this out so that I make sure I get all the members named correctly. And we'll just put this up here for now. All right, so for example, this is the syntax, this is the form that we're going to use. So when we talk about CPU usage, instead of saying 50% here, which was our just placeholder, we're going to say stat data dot CPU usage, just like that. And then we can use this everywhere where we care about the CPU percentage, which is also going to be the value of our progress bar. So let's just put it in there, there, and there. Okay, easy. And now the same thing here for memory usage. And then for our temperature, we've already got our temp C here. Let's go ahead and do our temp F. Okay, now if we've wired everything up correctly, that should all load into our view. So let's see what we get. Perfect. We've got our CPU usage at 57, our memory at 33. It adjusts the progress bar, and then we've got all of our more detailed memory information here in the table. And if we hit F5, this will just continue to update. Perfect. Now let's get rid of this ugly line up here. That was just our placeholder there. Get rid of that. Okay. Now, this isn't ideal, right? I mean, we don't want to have to sit here and keep hitting F5 every time we want to see something new. We'd prefer to have something that updates all by itself. And let's see how easy that is to accomplish in Angular. All we have to do is come back in here, and we're going to follow the same pattern that we followed before. We're going to inject a built-in Angular module called timeout. Pass it into our function here. And this works a lot like the set timeout in JavaScript, except it's made specially for Angular. There's a lot of other considerations that Angular has to worry about, and so this sort of wraps that up nicely. But all we do here is we want to declare a function. So we're going to call a function tick, and we're going to execute that function immediately. And in that function, we're just going to do this. We're just move this down, put it in there, and then once we've called it, we're just going to say timeout tick every 2 seconds. So basically, we're just going to recall the tick function every 2 seconds. So let's see what that gives us. Okay, perfect. Now you can see that that's flashing every once in a while when it updates. You can see our CPU usage is updating here real time, but if you look over at the temperature, you see that flash right there. I don't know how well that's showing up in the screencast, but you get these flashes of just every time it updates there. And so the reason for that, if we come back to here, if we understand the asynchronous nature of JavaScript and this get call, this is making a REST HTTP call, but because it's asynchronous, it returns immediately, and so it returns blank information to stat data, and then when the HTTP call returns, then it comes back and populates it again. So what we're seeing is stat data is being blanked out for just a second and then being repopulated. And so we'd rather wait until it was fully populated to update our view. And that's really easy. What we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of this here. We're going to call this new data. And this get has a concept of a callback that we can pass it, that it will call when it's really done and ready to go. So what we'll do is we'll just move our scope.stat data down into there, and we will say set it to new data once it's ready. And that's really all we need to do. Hit save there. Now, if we refresh this, we shouldn't see that flash anymore. It should be nice and smooth, and it'll wait until it's got all the data to refresh the view. Perfect. So now that we've got this all set up, this is running in a virtual machine, an Ubuntu instance in a virtual machine. But what we really want to do is run this on our Raspberry Pi. Well, since Raspberry Pi, I'm running Raspbian, it's just a flavor of Linux, we can just port this over to our Raspberry Pi and run it from there. To get this to run on our Raspberry Pi, all we really need to do is move our project over to our Raspberry Pi. And you can do that in a number of ways. You can commit this to a Git repository, push it up to GitHub, pull it down onto your Pi, do file sharing. One of the things that I really like to do when I'm developing, I really love Git, but when I'm just messing around with small projects, I don't like the overhead of having to commit and push and pull and things like that. So I like to use Dropbox. And what I did was I wrote a thin Dropbox client in Python that I have on my Raspberry Pi that I can pull things down. So what I'm going to do is come over here into projects where we've got our Pi monitor here. And I'm going to copy everything except the node modules. Now there's a lot of files in there, and those can all be regenerated on a Raspberry Pi just by running npm install. And so we don't want to have the overhead of copying those around. So I'm going to leave those out. I'm going to copy all these files, come back up into Dropbox, and I'm going to just create a new folder here called Pi Monitor. And I'm just going to paste them all in there. All right, once that's synced up, we'll just come back to our terminal here. Go ahead and close that. Let's SSH into our Pi. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cd into my projects here, and I'm just going to do I have a Pi monitor there. Let's remove that so you don't think I'm just doing smoke and mirrors here. Okay, so I'm going to do a brand new makedir on Pi monitor, and we'll cd into that, and I'll do an ls just so you can see that it's empty. What I'm going to do is just, like I say, I have this utility that I wrote. It's called preheat, and I'm going to tell it to look for a file in my Dropbox account called pinodestats.js. And I have this argument I can pass it, a -r, that says give me that file, every other file in the directory that contains it, and all subdirectories. So we'll just hit that. It should only just take a minute here. Okay, that took about 10 seconds or so. Now if we do an ls, you can see we've got our app.js, our package.json, bin, public routes, all that stuff. And all we need to do is run npm install. And that's going to pull down that node modules folder that we didn't copy over. Now this takes a little bit longer on the Raspberry Pi. It's got a lot of packages that it needs to pull down. And so we'll go ahead and fast forward. All right, once that's finished, we're basically ready to run. One thing that I do want to change is if we go into the pinode.js, if you remember, we had changed that to use these temporary things. So we'll just cut those changes out because we want it to actually read the temperature reported by the Raspberry Pi. So let's uncomment all these lines, and we'll save that. And all we should have to do at this point is the same thing we did before. We would node on the www, run that, and we'll come back over to our Explorer window here. Now 14 is the address of my virtual machine, 17 is the address of my actual Raspberry Pi. So let's hit enter on that and see what we get. Won't serve it up quite as fast, but there we have it. Updating in real time from our Raspberry Pi. So this is a great example. We pulled a bunch of technology together here. We used Node.js, Express on top of that to create ourselves a web server. We're using Angular to update our view, Bootstrap to make it look nice. It didn't take us very long to put this together. And the important thing that I want you to remember here as well is that now that we have this running, it's just a matter of modifying our pinodestats.js. We can expand this to return any kind of information we want. We have all of the plumbing in place, and what it really comes down to is back here, if we go to our stats, if we just want to add pieces of data to this, we can start adding them to our view. Like I said, all the plumbing is in place for you to do some really awesome things here. Really hope that you've enjoyed this microcast. I just wanted to show you how you can take different pieces of technology, and as you get proficient in them, you can pull them all together, make some really cool stuff. I'd love to hear about the things that you're making. Hit me up on Twitter or send me an email. I'd love to help you if I can. We'll see you next time.